It is October 1917. In Petrograd, the world stands on the edge of upheaval as two names prepare to leave their mark on history's darkest pages. Leon Trotsky of Russia and Vyacheslav Molotov of the Soviet Union. Their paths carved a revolution, yet their legacies remain steeped in division, fear, and the relentless machinery of Soviet power. Let us begin with the first, Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was born on the 7th of November in the year 1879 in the rural village of Yanovka, located in the Kherson Governorate of the Russian Empire. How did a boy raised on a remote farm become one of the most dangerous minds in global revolution? What turned a gifted student into a radical agitator hunted by empires? And how did this brilliant outcast rise to command armies, only to end up marked for death by his own comrades? Please watch my full video until the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. Trotsky's given name at birth was Lev Davidovich Bronstein. He was the fifth child born to David Lintievich Bronstein, a well-off farmer of Jewish background, and his wife Anna. Although his family spoke Russian and Ukrainian at home, they did not practice any religion, and Trotsky would carry a secular worldview throughout his life. From a young age, his father encouraged education, sending him to Odessa when he was only 8 years old. There, Trotsky studied in a German language school, a rare opportunity in a deeply segregated empire. He excelled in subjects like science and mathematics, but it was the city's cosmopolitan energy that shaped his political imagination. His school years were marked by discipline and ambition, but also by quiet defiance. By his teenage years, his mind had already turned toward revolution. In the mid-1990s, as the Russian Empire simmered with unrest, young Lev Bronstein stepped into a new phase of life. At just 16 years old, he moved to the southern port town of Nikolaev, now called Mykolaiv in modern-day Ukraine. It was here that the seeds of rebellion were first sown. Initially drawn to populist movements known as the Narodniks, Lev was soon persuaded by deeper Marxist ideas, thanks in large part to a young woman named Alexandra Sokolovskaya, who would become his first wife. The Narodniks believed in inspiring revolution through rural peasants. But Marxism promised a more scientific and global path to dismantling monarchies. This vision captured Trotsky's imagination. By the time he graduated from high school with top honors, he was already deeply involved in underground activism. Trotsky briefly enrolled in Odessa University to study mathematics and engineering, impressing his professors with his sharp mind. But the draw of revolution was stronger than any lecture hall. Within a year, he abandoned his formal studies and returned to Nikolaev to co-found the South Russian Workers' Union. It was a daring move for a teenager, organizing illegal gatherings, writing fiery pamphlets, and spreading socialist ideas among factory workers and students. Operating under the alias Lvov, Trotsky threw himself into the work of revolution with unmatched energy. But the Tsarist regime was watching. In January of 1898, the secret police made their move, arresting more than 200 members of the group, including Trotsky himself. His path as a student was over. His path as a revolutionary had just begun. After his arrest in January of 1898, Lev Bronstein, now marked as a dangerous agitator, entered the harsh machinery of imperial Russian justice. He was just 18 years old when he was dragged through a rotating cycle of prisons across Nikolaev, Odessa, Kherson, and finally Moscow. In the capital, he encountered other revolutionaries and got his hands on Lenin's newly published work, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. These long, cold months behind bars sharpened his ideology and introduced him to a wider network of radical thinkers. In the summer of 1899, while still in prison, he married Alexandra Sokolovskaya, a fellow Marxist who had been arrested alongside him. Their ceremony was small and modest, performed by a Jewish chaplain, and the union bound them not only as spouses but as co-conspirators. The following year, they were both sentenced to 4 years of exile in the remote Siberian region of the Baikal area. In Siberia, Trotsky immersed himself in books, philosophy, history, and especially Marxist theory. He began contributing to Iskra, the Spark, the revolutionary newspaper that would shape the direction of Russian socialism. It was here that he first became aware of internal party debates between economists and those who pushed for political revolution. But Trotsky was never content to remain in isolation. In the summer of 1902, he executed a daring escape, hiding inside a hay cart and slipping away undetected. He left behind his wife and 2 daughters, who later joined him in freedom. It was during this escape that he adopted the alias that would define him for the rest of his life, Leon Trotsky. When Leon Trotsky arrived in London in the autumn of 1902, he was only 22 years old, but his ideas were already forging iron. He immediately found himself in the orbit of Russia's most powerful revolutionary minds, including Vladimir Lenin, Georgy Plekhanov, and Julius Martov. These men formed the editorial board of Iskra, the Spark, a revolutionary newspaper smuggled into Russia to fuel anti-Tsarist sentiment. Trotsky, writing under the pen name Pierrot, quickly emerged as one of its most passionate voices. Though young, Trotsky's sharp wit and fearless energy impressed Lenin. He was nearly added to Iskra's board, but opposition from Plekhanov blocked the decision. Trotsky remained on the sidelines, unofficial, yet indispensable. His articles, speeches, and tireless editing gave Iskra a radical clarity that stirred thousands back in Russia. In London, Trotsky also met Natalia Sedova, a fellow revolutionary and his eventual life partner. They married in 1903, and their intellectual bond would sustain them through decades of upheaval. During this same period, he officially adopted Trotsky as his revolutionary name, reportedly taken from a jailer in Odessa. It was more than a pseudonym. It was his shield. But ideological storms were brewing. In August of 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party fractured into 2 bitter factions, Lenin's Bolsheviks and Martov's Mensheviks. To many, Trotsky's support of Martov signaled a break with Lenin. Yet even as he joined the Mensheviks, Trotsky declared himself non-factional, believing unity was still possible. His efforts to bridge the growing divide would define the next phase of his life, and bring him into deeper conflict with Lenin than ever before. By the start of 1905, Russia was on the edge of a political explosion, and Leon Trotsky was about to step into the fire. Years of social unrest, imperial mismanagement, and military defeat against Japan had pushed workers and intellectuals toward revolution. On the 9th of January, a peaceful workers' march to the Winter Palace ended in bloodshed as Tsarist troops opened fire. The massacre, later called Bloody Sunday, ignited strikes across the empire. Trotsky, writing from abroad, rushed back into Russia. Using the name Yanovsky, he returned in February and quietly entered St. Petersburg, working underground with Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and unaffiliated radicals. That same year, an unprecedented body was formed, the St. Petersburg Soviet, a council of workers' deputies designed to coordinate the strikes. Though Trotsky was not its founder, his leadership soon transformed it. When the Soviet's original chairman was arrested, Trotsky was elected as his replacement. Still only 26 years old, he now stood at the helm of a revolutionary experiment watched closely by both the public and the secret police. Trotsky delivered fiery speeches and wrote searing editorials, coordinating protests, strikes, and publications that reached hundreds of thousands. In one bold act, he declared that debts owed by the Tsar's regime were illegitimate, sending tremors through foreign banks. The defiant stance only deepened the government's resolve. On the 3rd of December, troops surrounded the Soviet and arrested its leaders. Trotsky was sent to prison once again, this time awaiting trial for leading an armed rebellion. But even behind bars, his influence grew. The revolution had failed, but Trotsky's name had been permanently etched into history. After his arrest in late 1905, Leon Trotsky faced trial alongside the other leaders of the St. Petersburg Soviet. By October of 1906, the verdict was delivered: internal exile in the remote Siberian region of Obdorsk. But Trotsky had other plans. Just months into his sentence, in January of 1907, he escaped while in transit and fled the empire once more, this time heading west to London, then on to Vienna. In exile, Trotsky connected with European socialist circles and renewed his revolutionary writings. Settling in Vienna, he joined the Austrian Social Democratic Party and wrote regularly for Russian and Ukrainian newspapers. It was here that he formed a lifelong friendship with Adolf Joffe and developed an interest in psychoanalysis, an unusual hobby for a Marxist. But his real contribution came in 1908 with the launch of Pravda, a biweekly Russian-language socialist newspaper for industrial workers back home. Co-edited with Joffe and Matvey Skoblev, the publication was smuggled across borders and into factories, reaching a wide underground audience. Avoiding factional politics, Pravda appealed to workers across ideological divides. For many, it became their first taste of Marxist thought written in plain, passionate language. Trotsky poured himself into this effort, traveling across Europe to fundraise and organize. The paper struggled financially, often printing irregularly, but its impact was undeniable. Even as party splits deepened, Pravda remained a unifying voice, at least for a time. In these years of exile, Trotsky refined his vision of revolution not just as a national struggle, but a global awakening. The battles within Russia were just the beginning. By 1912, Leon Trotsky had become a seasoned revolutionary with a sharp pen and restless spirit. As the Russian socialist movement fractured further, he sought unity by organizing the so-called August Bloc in Vienna, an effort to bridge the divide between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Though the attempt ultimately failed, Trotsky remained committed to international revolution. That same year, he took on a new role that would carry him into the heart of conflict: war correspondent. Working for the newspaper Kiev Missile, Trotsky traveled to the Balkans to report on the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. His dispatches were vivid and unflinching. He condemned ethnic cleansing by the Serbian army against Albanian civilians, exposing atrocities that many European newspapers glossed over. In these moments, his journalism became a weapon, a way to challenge imperialist narratives and awaken the conscience of his readers. But a far greater storm was brewing. In August of 1914, World War I erupted. Austria-Hungary declared war on Russia, and Trotsky, living in Vienna, was suddenly an enemy alien. He fled to neutral Switzerland and soon after to France. There in Paris, he began editing Nash Slovo, Our Word, a socialist newspaper advocating an anti-war position. He clashed fiercely with European socialist parties who supported their own governments in the war, seeing such loyalty as betrayal. In 1915, Trotsky attended the Zimmerwald Conference, joining Lenin and other exiles in calling for global revolution over national allegiance. But unlike Lenin, Trotsky hoped to unite the anti-war left rather than split it. These years hardened his view that peace could not come through diplomacy alone. The world, he believed, had to be torn down and rebuilt. As the world collapsed into war, Leon Trotsky's path led him further west. In late 1916, French authorities expelled him for his anti-war agitation. Spain refused him entry, and so on the 25th of December, he boarded a ship bound for the United States. He arrived in New York City in January of 1917 and briefly settled in the Bronx. There, he wrote for the Russian-language paper Novy Mir and gave fiery speeches to immigrant workers, still pressing for an end to the imperialist war. But within weeks, everything changed. In March of 1917, news arrived that Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated following mass protests in Petrograd. The centuries-old Russian monarchy had collapsed. The February Revolution, driven by hunger, soldiers' mutiny, and strikes, had succeeded. For Trotsky, it was the moment he had waited for. He left New York aboard the SS Christianiafjord, but the British Navy intercepted the ship in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Suspicious of his revolutionary ties, they detained him at the Amherst internment camp. He spent a month there, giving speeches, arguing with guards, and stirring unrest among prisoners. After pressure from the Russian provisional government, the British released him on the 29th of April. Trotsky arrived in Petrograd on the 17th of May. The political landscape was chaotic. Dozens of socialist factions competed for influence. Trotsky joined the Mezhrayantsy, a non-aligned Marxist group with growing power. As tensions escalated, he rose quickly within their ranks. That summer, after the failed July Days uprising, he was arrested, but public support was building. When General Kornilov's coup attempt failed, Trotsky was freed. The stage was now set for a far more radical revolution. By the autumn of 1917, Leon Trotsky had become one of the most electrifying figures in Petrograd. After his release from jail, he formally joined the Bolsheviks, bringing with him the support of the Mezhrayantsy and a reputation for revolutionary brilliance. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was rapidly losing control as workers, soldiers, and sailors looked to the Soviets for leadership. Trotsky was elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet in early October, placing him in a position of extraordinary influence. Working closely with Lenin, he became the architect of the armed uprising. While Lenin operated mostly in hiding, Trotsky took to the streets and assembly halls, rallying forces under the banner of the Military Revolutionary Committee. He coordinated Red Guards, garrison soldiers, and sailors from Kronstadt, ensuring that key bridges, telegraph offices, and train stations were seized swiftly and with minimal bloodshed. On the night of October 25th, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace, headquarters of the provisional government. By the next morning, Lenin declared that power had shifted to the Soviets. The October Revolution had succeeded. Trotsky's leadership was undeniable. Even Joseph Stalin, in a now-suppressed article from 1918, credited him with orchestrating the uprising's strategy and execution. Yet Trotsky did more than organize a coup. He gave the revolution its thunderous voice, delivering speeches that ignited crowds and silenced opposition. In a historic moment at the Congress of Soviets, he dismissed moderate socialists who walked out in protest, declaring, "Go where you belong, from the dustbin of history." With those words, Trotsky helped seal the fate of an empire and ignite the fire of a new world. In the aftermath of the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks moved quickly to consolidate power. Vladimir Lenin appointed Leon Trotsky as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, tasking him with one of the new regime's most urgent challenges, negotiating peace with the Central Powers. Russia, exhausted by World War I, needed to withdraw. But at what cost? Trotsky's first move shocked the world. He published the secret treaties signed between the old Russian Empire and its allies, exposing plans to divide colonies and redraw borders. The revelation humiliated Britain and France, undermining the moral high ground of their war aim. Peace talks began in December of 1917 in the city of Brest-Litovsk. At first, Trotsky sent his trusted friend Adolf Joffe to lead the Soviet delegation. But as the scale of German demands became clear, including the loss of Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states, Trotsky took over personally. His strategy was bold and unorthodox: delay the talks, stall the signatures, and wait for a workers' revolution to erupt in Germany. Trotsky proposed a daring compromise: no war, no peace. He declared Russia's exit from the war but refused to sign a treaty. The Germans, unimpressed, resumed their military advance. With Petrograd under threat, Lenin insisted on signing. Trotsky, still hoping for a German uprising, abstained from the final vote. On the 3rd of March in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed without his name. Though it secured peace, it came at a heavy territorial price. Trotsky resigned from his post days later. But Lenin had other plans for him. The revolution now needed not just words, it needed an army. In March of 1918, Leon Trotsky stepped into the role that would define his legend and his infamy. Appointed People's Commissar of Army and Navy Affairs, he was now the commander of the Red Army, tasked with defending the fragile Bolshevik state against a rising tide of civil war. The empire had shattered, and out of its broken pieces, royalists, liberals, foreign armies, and nationalists formed the White Movement, determined to crush the revolution. Trotsky approached this chaos with brutal clarity. He abolished the old post of commander-in-chief and centralized military power under his own authority. While other Bolsheviks believed the army should be composed entirely of loyal revolutionaries, Trotsky took a different view. He recruited former Tsarist officers, so-called military specialists, and paired them with political commissars to ensure loyalty. Discipline was harsh, defections were punished severely, and executions were not uncommon. To inspire the troops and maintain control, Trotsky turned a train into his mobile command center. Painted red and armored like a fortress, this train carried weapons, printing presses, and speakers through vast war-torn regions. From it, Trotsky delivered rousing speeches and issued direct orders on the front lines. Despite early defeats and internal dissent, his strategy worked. By the end of 1918, the Red Army had grown from a ragtag militia to a force of over 1 million soldiers. Through grit, terror, and relentless coordination, Trotsky held the Republic together. Many hated his methods, even within the Communist Party, but few could deny his success. Without Trotsky, the Bolsheviks might never have survived their blood-soaked birth. As the Russian Civil War intensified, Leon Trotsky's role expanded from military strategist to enforcer of revolutionary survival. The Bolsheviks faced enemies on every front: foreign invasions, internal uprisings, and sabotage from within. It was in this climate of fear and desperation that the policy of Red Terror took hold, casting a long and bitter shadow over Trotsky's legacy. In late 1918, after an assassination attempt on Lenin and the murder of Bolshevik leaders, the Cheka, Russia's secret police, was given full authority to crush opposition. Although Trotsky did not create the Cheka, he strongly supported its mission. He viewed terror as a necessary tool in a war where mercy meant defeat. Trotsky famously declared that revolutions are not polite affairs. They are civil wars fought to the end. Controversial decisions followed. Hostage-taking was introduced to prevent defection among officers. especially those from the old Tsarist regime. Families of potential traitors were held to ensure obedience. While Trotsky insisted that none were executed unless betrayal was proven, critics saw it as a dangerous descent into cruelty. He also clashed with fellow Bolsheviks who accused him of relying too heavily on former imperial officers. His insistence on strict discipline, compulsory conscription, and centralized command fueled the rise of the military opposition within the Communist Party. But Trotsky was unmoved. In his eyes, the stakes were nothing less than the future of socialism itself. The Red Army, he believed, had to survive at all costs, even if it meant using fear as a weapon. For Trotsky, the revolution was no longer just an idea. It was a battlefield where compromise meant extinction. With the Red Army victorious and the Civil War drawing to a close by 1921, Leon Trotsky emerged as one of the most powerful men in Soviet Russia, second only to Lenin himself. But peace brought a different kind of struggle. The battle now shifted from trenches and rail cars to party meetings and ideological wars. The enemy was no longer external, it was within. In the early post-war years, Trotsky clashed with fellow Bolsheviks over the future of the revolution. He argued for rapid industrialization, internal party democracy, and continued international revolution. His vision stood in sharp contrast to the rising influence of Joseph Stalin, who favored a slower, more controlled path and prioritized building socialism within Soviet borders. After Lenin's health began to fail in 1922, the question of succession loomed large. Though Lenin personally admired Trotsky's intellect, he feared his arrogance. In his final writings, later known as Lenin's Testament, he warned the party about Stalin's growing power, but also noted Trotsky's tendency to alienate allies. These warnings were suppressed after Lenin's death in January of 1924. Stalin, meanwhile, had been quietly building a network of loyalists throughout the party's inner structure. Trotsky, focused on ideas rather than politics, underestimated this growing threat. By 1925, he had been pushed out of key positions, isolated from decision-making, and increasingly branded as a divisive figure. Though he tried to rally support through the left opposition, Trotsky's efforts were blocked at every turn. Censored, sidelined, and smeared, the once revered revolutionary was now a political outcast in the very system he had helped create. His greatest enemy was no longer the Tsar, it was the machinery of the party itself. By the end of 1927, Leon Trotsky's fate within the Soviet Union was sealed. Expelled from the Communist Party and later from the Politburo, he was exiled to the remote city of Alma-Ata in Central Asia. Just a year later, in 1929, he was deported from the Soviet Union entirely, banished from the land he had helped revolutionize. Thus began a long and restless exile that would span continents and deepen both his fame and isolation. Trotsky first settled in Turkey, living under surveillance near Istanbul. There, he resumed writing with relentless urgency, pouring his ideas into books and essays. His most powerful work during this time was The Revolution Betrayed, published in 1936. In it, he argued that Stalin's regime had hijacked the revolution, creating a bureaucratic dictatorship rather than a true workers' state. He called the Soviet Union a degenerated workers' state, a phrase that would echo across the left for decades. From Turkey, he moved to France, then Norway, and finally to Mexico in 1937. Everywhere he went, Trotsky attracted journalists, intellectuals, and political refugees. While many on the left admired his vision, others saw him as a divisive figure. Still, his writings shaped socialist movements in Europe, Latin America, and even the United States. In Mexico, he was welcomed by the famed artists Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and given asylum by President Lázaro Cárdenas. Trotsky remained active in global politics, founding the Fourth International in 1938, a new movement aimed at continuing the revolutionary legacy he believed Stalin had betrayed. But even in distant exile, he knew the reach of the Kremlin was long and its memory unforgiving. Leon Trotsky was assassinated on the 21st of August in the year 1940 in Mexico City after being struck the previous day with an ice axe by a Stalinist agent. He died defiant until the end. Though exiled and hunted, he never abandoned his belief in permanent revolution. To some, he was a dangerous dissenter. To others, a visionary betrayed. His legacy lives on, etched in ink, exile, and blood, as a voice that challenged tyranny and dreamed of a world still waiting to be born. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Vyacheslav Molotov was born on the 9th of March in the year 1890 in the small village of Kukarka, located in the Vyatka Governorate of the Russian Empire. How did this quiet boy from a provincial town become one of the most powerful men in Soviet history? What inner convictions shaped his transformation from a student radical into Stalin's trusted right hand? And what price did he pay for decades of loyalty to a brutal regime? Molotov was born as Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Scriabin into a modest, educated family of Russian Orthodox background. Though not of aristocratic blood, his early upbringing was steeped in disciplined values, conservative traditions, and a deep reverence for state authority. But by his teenage years, these values would begin to crumble in the face of revolutionary ideology. At the age of 16, Molotov enrolled in the Kazan Real School, where he was introduced to Marxist literature. The writings of Karl Marx, Georgy Plekhanov, and especially Vladimir Lenin would become central to his worldview. In 1899, he joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, just as it was gaining ground among disillusioned youth and factory workers. He began using the alias Molotov, derived from the Russian word for hammer, symbolizing strength and resolve. His early revolutionary work included distributing pamphlets, organizing meetings, and writing under various pseudonyms. Arrested in 1909 for subversive activities, he was briefly exiled to the Vologda region. Though still young, Molotov had made his choice. The empire that had shaped his childhood would become his enemy, and the revolution his destiny. By the early 1900s, Vyacheslav Molotov had embedded himself deep within the revolutionary underground. After his brief exile, he moved to St. Petersburg, where he aligned fully with the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It was here that Molotov first came under the influence of Vladimir Lenin, a figure who would shape his political path for decades to come. Lenin, then operating from abroad, relied heavily on trusted organizers inside Russia. Molotov became one of them. In 1911, he was recruited to work on Pravda, the underground Bolshevik newspaper. Though Lenin would later accuse Molotov of being overly cautious in editorial matters, he respected the young man's discipline, organization, and unwavering commitment to party lines. Molotov worked alongside other rising figures like Joseph Stalin and Lev Kamenev, quietly building networks and spreading propaganda under threat of arrest. He avoided flamboyance, preferring methodical planning over emotional rhetoric. In Lenin's view, Molotov was a reliable functionary, a man who followed orders without question. During these years, the Bolshevik Party was fragmented and often under surveillance. Molotov helped navigate these challenges by managing funds, coordinating print operations, and maintaining contact with local cells. He was arrested again in 1915, but managed to escape and continue his work, showing the kind of persistence that would define his career. By the time of the February Revolution in 1917, Molotov had earned a place within Lenin's inner circle, not by charisma or battlefield glory, but through steady loyalty and tireless labor. In a movement that prized boldness, his value came from something quieter: obedience and trust. As the Russian Empire unraveled in 1917, Vyacheslav Molotov returned to Petrograd and quickly immersed himself in the revolutionary wave. When the provisional government took power after the February Revolution, Molotov was one of the few senior Bolsheviks already in the capital. While Lenin remained in exile, Molotov co-edited Pravda and helped steer the party through its initial opposition to the new regime. Once Lenin returned in April, Molotov willingly stepped aside, resuming his supportive role. His deference to Lenin became a defining feature of his political identity. In the chaotic months that followed, Molotov was appointed to the Bolshevik-controlled Petrograd Soviet and the Military Revolutionary Committee, placing him at the center of planning for the October Revolution. During the night of October 25th, when the Bolsheviks seized control of the Winter Palace and deposed the provisional government, Molotov was not among the visible leaders giving fiery speeches. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, coordinating the takeover of ministries, organizing local committees, and ensuring the machinery of revolution turned smoothly. As the new Soviet regime faced immediate threats from within and abroad, Molotov was dispatched to key logistical roles during the Civil War. He was appointed to regional party leaderships in Ukraine and later the Urals, overseeing supply chains, propaganda, and the enforcement of Bolshevik rule. Though he never commanded troops, his contribution was administrative and ruthless, rooting out dissent, mobilizing food requisitions, and maintaining Bolshevik control through the darkest years of conflict. Molotov's quiet but firm presence became a model for the new Soviet bureaucrat, efficient, ideological, and unshaken by moral dilemmas. His path to power was not paved by charisma, but by loyalty, precision, and Lenin's trust. With the Bolsheviks firmly in control by the early 1920s, Vyacheslav Molotov rose steadily through the ranks of the Communist Party. Following Lenin's declining health and eventual death in January of 1924, the question of succession loomed large. Though Trotsky was widely viewed as Lenin's ideological heir, Molotov aligned himself early with a quieter but far more strategic contender, Joseph Stalin. Molotov's unwavering loyalty did not go unnoticed. In 1921, he became a full member of the Central Committee and a candidate member of the Politburo. By 1926, he was elevated to full Politburo status, marking his entry into the highest circle of Soviet power. Stalin saw in him not a rival, but a dependable executor of policy. While others debated theory or ideology, Molotov mastered procedure, discipline, and enforcement. As General Secretary, Stalin relied on Molotov to implement party directives with exacting precision. In 1930, Molotov was appointed chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, the Soviet equivalent of Prime Minister. Though Stalin retained ultimate control, it was Molotov who signed the orders, issued the decrees, and oversaw the massive machinery of government. Behind the scenes, he helped Stalin neutralize rivals like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and eventually Trotsky. Molotov did not initiate purges, but he carried them out without hesitation. His ability to navigate the treacherous terrain of party politics without challenging Stalin's supremacy made him indispensable. By the end of the decade, Molotov had become known as the Iron Commissar, a man whose loyalty was beyond question and whose name would be etched into some of the Soviet Union's most consequential and controversial decisions. As chairman of the Council of People's Commissars during the early 1930s, Vyacheslav Molotov became one of the chief architects of Stalin's grand transformation of the Soviet economy. This period was defined by two sweeping and brutal campaigns: forced collectivization of agriculture and the rapid industrialization of the nation. Both were intended to modernize the Soviet Union, but at an immense human cost. Molotov played a central role in planning and executing these policies. He enforced the merging of individual peasant farms into collective state-run units, known as kolkhozes. Those who resisted, branded as kulaks or wealthy peasants, were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. Molotov oversaw these crackdowns with clinical detachment, believing they were necessary to eliminate class enemies and achieve socialist progress. He traveled to rural regions personally, supervising collectivization quotas and ensuring compliance. Famines erupted as grain was requisitioned for export and industrial funding, most horrifically in Ukraine during the Holodomor, where millions starved. Molotov dismissed reports of suffering, defending the policy as vital for the survival of the Soviet state. At the same time, Molotov championed the first five-year plan, a staggering campaign to industrialize cities, build steel plants, and electrify the nation. Under his direction, the government set impossible production targets and demanded unwavering discipline from workers. Though the Soviet Union achieved significant economic growth during this era, it came at a staggering moral price. Molotov, however, remained resolute. In his eyes, the revolution had always required sacrifice, and if that meant millions would suffer to build a new world, so be it. For him, the measure of success was not compassion, but control. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union had entered one of the darkest chapters in its history, the Great Purge. Orchestrated by Joseph Stalin, this campaign sought to eliminate all perceived threats to his rule. As one of Stalin's closest allies, Vyacheslav Molotov played a critical role in facilitating, legitimizing, and defending the repression that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Molotov was not a passive observer. He sat on the Politburo and regularly signed execution lists, many of which included his own comrades and colleagues. These lists, cold, typed documents, contained the names of accused party members, military officers, scientists, and artists. Once signed by top leaders, including Molotov, the victims were swiftly arrested, tortured, and often shot. Despite his reserved demeanor, Molotov embraced the logic of purging. He publicly defended the trials, denouncing the accused as traitors, spies, and saboteurs. Even when friends and fellow revolutionaries were implicated, he rarely intervened. Most chillingly, when his own wife, Polina Zemchizhina, was arrested years later, Molotov did not protest. He remained silent, choosing party loyalty over personal devotion. Molotov also helped implement the purge of the Red Army's high command, a move that weakened Soviet defenses but eliminated potential challengers. He justified these actions as painful but necessary cleansing steps to protect the revolution from internal rot. His legacy during this period is one of unwavering complicity. While Stalin issued the orders, it was men like Molotov who ensured they were carried out with precision. For Molotov, ideology demanded discipline, and discipline, in his mind, left no room for mercy. In the summer of 1939, as Europe braced for war, Vyacheslav Molotov stepped onto the world stage in a role that would shock both allies and enemies. With Stalin growing distrustful of the West, and Hitler's ambitions threatening to ignite global conflict, Molotov, recently appointed People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, was tasked with securing Soviet interests by any means necessary. What followed was one of the most controversial diplomatic moves in modern history. On the 23rd of August, Molotov signed a non-aggression treaty with Nazi Germany's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. Known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the agreement publicly declared peace between the two regimes. But hidden within it was a secret protocol, the planned division of Eastern Europe between the Soviets and the Germans. Poland would be carved up. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were assigned to Moscow's sphere. The pact stunned the world. Stalin and Hitler, once ideological enemies, had become strategic partners, and it was Molotov's signature that sealed the deal. Just days later, on the 1st of September, Germany invaded Poland from the west. On the 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Molotov justified the move as a protection of Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities, though few believed it. In a chilling radio address, he claimed the Polish state had ceased to exist. For many, the pact was a betrayal of anti-fascist principles. But to Molotov, it was a tactical masterstroke, buying time, gaining territory, and avoiding immediate war. In his cold calculus, ideology could wait. Geopolitics could not. When Nazi Germany broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact by launching Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June in the year 1941, the Soviet Union was thrown into chaos. For Vyacheslav Molotov, still serving as People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, the betrayal marked a turning point in both global conflict and personal duty. His role now shifted from diplomatic strategist to wartime negotiator and spokesman for a nation under siege. Molotov addressed the Soviet people in a grim radio broadcast, informing them of the invasion and declaring a defensive war against fascism. It was his voice, not Stalin's, that first carried the message of national resistance. Calm, precise, and deliberate, Molotov urged unity in the face of destruction. His speech marked the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. In the early war years, Molotov became the face of Soviet diplomacy. He brokered critical alliances with the Western powers, traveling to London and Washington to negotiate military aid and coordinated efforts against Germany. His meetings with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt were cautious but productive, paving the way for the Lend-Lease Act, which funneled weapons, vehicles, and supplies into Soviet hands. Despite ideological gulfs, Molotov maintained a cool and professional tone with capitalist leaders. He rarely smiled, spoke in rigid formulas, and never strayed from Stalin's line. Western diplomats described him as impenetrable, like a piece of granite. As the war raged on, Molotov juggled diplomacy and internal politics, ensuring that Stalin remained informed and dominant in all negotiations. Though he did not command troops, Molotov's diplomatic resilience helped turn the tide in Moscow's favor. In wartime, he proved that power could be wielded not only through force, but through words spoken with unwavering certainty. As World War II progressed, Vyacheslav Molotov emerged as the Soviet Union's chief diplomat on the global stage. While Stalin orchestrated military and domestic command from Moscow, Molotov traversed continents, forging uneasy alliances with Western powers whose systems and values clashed deeply with communism. These missions placed him at the heart of negotiations that would reshape the world. In 1942, Molotov made a dramatic journey to London and Washington. Traveling in a sealed Soviet aircraft through war-torn skies, he met with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt to discuss opening a second front in Europe. Though Allied leaders hesitated, his mission succeeded in securing promises of military aid and deeper collaboration. His steely manner, tightly controlled speech, and refusal to be flattered made an impression. British observers noted his imperturbable nature, even in rooms thick with tension. Later, Molotov played key roles in the Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam conferences. While Stalin usually attended in person, Molotov handled much of the background diplomacy, drafting proposals, negotiating behind closed doors, and managing the details that would define post-war Europe. He also signed treaties with France, Britain, and the United States, formalizing the anti-Nazi alliance despite deep ideological mistrust. Though often viewed by Western diplomats as rigid and joyless, Molotov was unfailingly prepared, loyal, and relentless. He insisted on Soviet demands and rarely yielded ground. In these critical years, he was more than a messenger. He was Stalin's shield and interpreter in a world that neither trusted nor understood the Soviet regime. Molotov's diplomacy helped secure not only wartime survival, but the geopolitical foundations of the Soviet Union's future empire in Eastern Europe. With Nazi Germany defeated in 1945, the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as a superpower, but one defined by scars, suspicion, and strategic ambition. As Foreign Commissar, Vyacheslav Molotov shifted from wartime alliance building to post-war consolidation. His mission was now to turn military victory into long-term dominance, and to draw the lines that would define the Cold War. Molotov played a central role in establishing Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. Under his guidance, new communist governments were installed in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Through treaties, economic pressure, and covert assistance, Molotov ensured that each country remained loyal to Moscow's vision. In his eyes, this was not expansionism. It was a protective buffer against future invasion. In 1947, Molotov famously rejected the American-sponsored Marshall Plan, which offered post-war economic aid to Europe. He dismissed it as an attempt to lure Eastern countries into capitalist dependence. His refusal solidified the divide between East and West, and led to the Soviet establishment of the Cominform, a network for coordinating global communist movements. Western leaders increasingly viewed Molotov as the hard face of Soviet foreign policy. He was unyielding at United Nations meetings, often speaking last and offering sharp rebukes to Western proposals. It was during this time that Winston Churchill famously declared an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, a metaphor born from Molotov's own diplomacy. Despite his rigid posture, Molotov was calculating rather than impulsive. He understood that ideology had to be enforced with structure. Through every speech and negotiation, he reinforced a single truth: the Soviet Union would never again be vulnerable, and it would never yield to Western pressure. Through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, Vyacheslav Molotov remained one of Joseph Stalin's most loyal and visible lieutenants. Their partnership, rooted in decades of shared struggle, endured longer than any other among the Soviet elite. Molotov had helped build Stalin's power and carried out his directives without question. But as Stalin aged and grew increasingly paranoid, even Molotov's unwavering loyalty could not protect him from suspicion. Despite his central role in foreign affairs, Molotov began to fall out of favor. Stalin grew frustrated with what he perceived as Molotov's excessive caution and rigid diplomacy. Tensions rose when Molotov's wife, Polina Zhemchuzhina, a prominent Soviet official herself, was arrested in 1949. She was accused of nationalist sympathies and secret Zionist affiliation. Stalin personally ordered her detainment, and Molotov, in a chilling act of obedience, offered no defense. He remained silent, choosing the party over his spouse. Though humiliated, Molotov maintained his post and continued to serve Stalin with precision. Yet within the Politburo, newer figures like Lavrentiy Beria and Georgy Malenkov began to eclipse him. Molotov's speeches grew less frequent, and his influence steadily declined. By the time of Stalin's death in March of 1953, Molotov was still a member of the inner circle, but no longer its center. His career, once marked by silent efficiency and institutional control, was entering a new and uncertain phase. He had spent decades defending a system built on repression, secrecy, and fear. Now, without Stalin's shadow to protect him, Molotov faced the unpredictable winds of post-Stalin power struggles and the looming reckoning with his past. With Stalin's death in March of 1953, the Soviet Union entered a volatile period of transition. Vyacheslav Molotov, long accustomed to carrying out orders, now found himself navigating a system without its supreme leader. Initially, he retained his post as foreign minister and even played a role in selecting the new leadership. But within months, it became clear that Nikita Khrushchev was emerging as the dominant figure, and that Molotov's old ways no longer suited the new era. Khrushchev sought to reform Soviet governance, reduce repression, and distance the party from Stalin's worst excesses. In his famous secret speech of 1956, he condemned Stalin's cult of personality and the purges, a direct challenge to men like Molotov, who had enabled and enforced that legacy. Molotov, deeply loyal to Stalin's memory, was appalled. He rejected Khrushchev's reforms and opposed efforts to liberalize policy or rehabilitate past victims. This resistance marked his political undoing. Khrushchev viewed Molotov as a relic of a darker time, a symbol of rigidity, fear, and blind obedience. In 1957, Molotov joined a failed attempt to remove Khrushchev from power, aligning with other senior officials in what became known as the anti-party group. The move backfired. Khrushchev survived and retaliated. Molotov was stripped of his posts, expelled from the Politburo, and assigned a minor diplomatic role as ambassador to Mongolia. It was a dramatic fall from grace. Once the voice of Soviet diplomacy and Stalin's most trusted executor, Molotov was now politically sidelined, his influence broken. He had devoted his life to the Soviet state, but in the shifting tides of history, even the most loyal servants could be cast aside. After his failed bid to oust Khrushchev and his subsequent demotion, Vyacheslav Molotov entered one of the most isolated chapters of his life. By the early 1960s, he had been expelled from the Communist Party altogether, a staggering fate for a man who had once helped build and guard its very foundations. But even in disgrace, Molotov clung fiercely to his beliefs. He refused to renounce Stalin, even as the party officially condemned him. When confronted with the atrocities of the Great Purge or the devastation of collectivization, Molotov did not waver. "We did the right thing," he insisted, maintaining that these harsh measures were necessary to preserve socialism. His ideological inflexibility became both his shield and his prison. Denied a platform, Molotov lived in quiet retirement. He wrote letters, received visitors, and gave interviews to a small circle of historians and admirers, always defending his record with icy precision. He was offered a chance to return to the party in later years, but refused to apologize for his past. Without remorse, he reiterated his loyalty to Stalin and the old Bolshevik principles. Though he had once operated at the heart of Soviet power, Molotov now watched from the margins as the world he helped construct evolved without him. He criticized Khrushchev's reforms, Brezhnev's stagnation, and even the broader trend toward détente with the West. In his mind, deviation from Stalin's path was weakness. Yet despite his isolation, Molotov remained a symbol of unyielding orthodoxy, of the revolution's hardest edge, and of a past the Soviet Union was struggling to confront. He lived as he had governed, unsmiling, steadfast, and unwilling to bend. In the final decades of his life, Vyacheslav Molotov remained a relic of a bygone era, isolated, defiant, yet never forgotten. After years of expulsion and silence, the Soviet leadership offered him an olive branch. In the mid-1960s and again in the 1970s, attempts were made to quietly rehabilitate Molotov, to restore some measure of dignity to a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of Soviet power. But Molotov complicated these efforts. When invited to rejoin the Communist Party, he refused to issue a formal apology or acknowledge any wrongdoing. His loyalty to Stalin and to the harsh methods of their rule remained unshaken. To him, admitting fault meant betraying the revolution, and that was a price he would not pay. Nevertheless, some accommodations were made. He was allowed to live comfortably in Moscow, received occasional visitors, and gave interviews that revealed a mind still sharp, calculating, and unwavering. In these conversations, he often reflected on history, but only through the lens of ideological certainty. He dismissed criticism of the purges, defended collectivization, and expressed pride in Soviet industrialization. Though no longer a public figure, Molotov's name evoked a complex mixture of fear, respect, and discomfort. He represented both the efficiency and brutality of Soviet governance, an executor of vision without hesitation. In retirement, he walked daily, read obsessively, and commented on world events with his trademark cold clarity. He witnessed the slow decline of the Soviet dream he had helped build, but still believed it had been worth the struggle. Even in old age, Molotov remained exactly what he had always been, a man of the party, forged in steel, unmoved by doubt or remorse. Vyacheslav Molotov died on the 8th of November in the year 1986 in Moscow, at the age of 96. He remained unrepentant to the end, defending Stalin and the brutal policies they enforced. Historians remain divided. Was he a loyal servant of state building or a cold enabler of tyranny? His legacy, like his name, is forever fused with both steel and silence. In life, he shaped a nation. In death, he left behind questions that still unsettle the conscience of history. What do you think about Leon Trotsky? Was Trotsky a visionary revolutionary, a master of words and strategy, who helped shape the Russian Revolution and dared to dream of a global workers' uprising? Or was he a doomed idealist, exiled, hunted, and ultimately betrayed by the very cause he once championed? And what about Vyacheslav Molotov? Was Molotov the steadfast architect of Soviet diplomacy, a loyal builder of empire who served with discipline and unwavering resolve? Or was he the cold executor of repression, a silent servant of terror, remembered more for signatures on execution lists than for peace treaties? We would love to hear your thoughts. Were these men builders of a new world or prisoners of the one they helped forge? Did their strength lie in belief or in obedience? History does not always offer clear heroes or villains, only choices, consequences, and legacies shaped by silence and conviction. Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past, stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.